invite you to be active after the speakers. I hope there's still some time for questions. The first one I call to the stage is the presenter of today, Jane Abodo. Jane, where are you, and can you please come forward?
Thank you, Anne. Yes, good afternoon, colleagues. I want to start from the theme, or maybe before I go to the theme of the conference, I want to thank my big brother, Haji, for pulling this off. We were warmly welcomed yesterday at the airport at Nairobi and at Mombasa. Your prosecutors were very, very efficient, and they made you look good. So I want to say thank you. And with your usual hospitality, we were not surprised that we were welcomed to a very sumptuous dinner last night. Though I didn't get to dance. I don't know whether Jan danced as usual. So I want to start with the theme of today's conference: effective mechanisms to respond to emerging crimes and transnational organized crime in Africa. This theme is so right at the right time, because when I looked through the visions and missions of most of our jurisdictions, which of course are Commonwealth, they speak to this theme. How do we actually relate? How do we effectively respond to emerging crimes? It is tough being a prosecutor and an investigator in this time when crime is changing every second. This calls for us prosecutors, investigators, and other stakeholders to sort of forecast crime. You forecast it like the weather is forecast. Like Europe, in America, before you go out, you look at the weather. Is it going to be shiny? Is it going to be raining? You carry an umbrella. So that's how I see that this is how we should now be operating in the crime environment. We have to forecast. If we're going to have elections, what are the obvious crimes that are going to come out of it? You prepare for that. Maybe if you don't have a department handling political crimes, you create one. If you're going to have, if there's famine, some calamity, you put in place, because there's going to be charity organizations going there, the real and the quacks, and there's going to be procurement, so there's going to be procurement fraud. So as prosecutors, you actually plan for that, so that when it happens, you are a little bit ready, though normally we are not very ready, but at least you're not taken unawares. So there's need for us now to start forecasting crime. There's also need to develop well-informed, forward-looking plans. Most of the speakers this morning have talked about that. The Global Horizon Scan. We have to interpret the key trends. You know, the criminals, unlike us, they actually take very keen note of the headlines. They read the headlines. There's COVID. They quickly go and start the scams. So they read the headlines and they take advantage of that. So it calls for more anticipatory modes rather than reactive. So the theme also speaks to the fact that crime has actually moved online. The dark web, everything is done now online. Trafficking in persons, trafficking in human organs, trafficking in wildlife. So everything has gone online. And the criminals have access to these sophisticated cyber tools. And most of the time, they are for free as we grapple. the next time I am invited to Mombasa, I should have forecast this. I should have come with, not in a suit. Yeah, the humidity. With the coming in of technology, new opportunities for crime are open. For the criminals and also for us as stakeholders in this. In 2013, the UK came up with a strategy to fight organized crime. It was built upon 4 principles of peace. And I'm thinking that these principles are still important even today. It speaks even to our situation today. The 4 P's are: 1, prepare. Number 2, prevent. The 3rd P is protect. And the last one is pursue. In preparing, you have to create a hostile environment for the criminals. Actually, no one is born a criminal. Come to think of it, no one. People become criminals because of the environment that they get themselves into, the opportunities that are offered to them, then they learn the job. We had a John Kagezi Memorial Week some 2 weeks ago, and the pastor who spoke was telling us about reaping and sowing. He was speaking to the integrity and professionalism of prosecutors and saying, when you take a bribe for the first time, you take it, you even keep away the money very far away. You don't want to see it. You're so uneasy about the whole thing. You can go after 1 week, you open, you see it is still there, you don't even want to touch it. But one day you'll get that money and you touch it. And then the second bribe you take, the third, you're so relaxed, you don't even think about it. So that is how we should. Let's prepare a hostile environment for criminals. Prevent. We have to stop individuals from becoming involved. This is preventive. You have to go out and actually get the young people, talk to them about the ills of corruption. Talk to them before they come into contact with the law. So we have to prevent. The 3rd one, protect. We have to add in our infrastructures. The ODPP's office. I was very happy with our guest of honor today when he says that the ODPP has been strengthened in terms of financials, in terms of making sure that they deliver on their mandate. That is what we should have, a strong prosecution system, strong investigative arm, and an independent judiciary. So, protect. The last one is pursue, prosecution. Of course, someone will say prosecution is like, it is what we really concentrate on, but sometimes it has a very low impact because of how long it takes to prosecute a crime, with so many challenges along the way. So prosecution is, maybe we should rethink, should we only do prosecutions, or should we have all the other mix? Let's have the other 3 P's and we see how it works out for us. Let's have a sort of a cocktail of all this. The Conference of Parties, United Nations Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, identified the following as emerging crimes. That's what the theme is talking about. Cybercrime, identity-related crimes, trafficking in cultural property, environmental crime, privacy, organ trafficking, and fraudulent medicine as new and emerging crimes that we are dealing with today. Technological advancement, increasing globalization, and the exponential growth of global markets have created so many opportunities for criminal activities with often low risk. My big brother Nojin said, normally with a low risk of detection, using new forms of anonymity, you can't get them. They commit the crime in seconds and they live without a trace. We have to go to cyberspace to do our investigations. Where do you start from? Crime is continually evolving and adapting, and it calls for us as prosecutors, investigators, and other stakeholders to evolve at the same time. The free movement of people, goods, services around the world has progressed so fast, and the ability of different states to catch up with this is always so tough. They always say that we are behind, 2 steps behind the criminals. We never make future laws. We make a law after a crime has been committed. Then we know that we have to legislate on this one. And for criminals, that's where they thrive most. New criminal trends have emerged. Crimes are committed in cyberspace successfully, concealing the identities of the perpetrators. With the current global connectivity, the connectivity is just out of this world. Technological advances can help investigators too. A lot of information is available on the net, electronic devices, chat groups, and all that, so we should move there. Though organized crime, illicit drug trafficking, and terrorism have been of major concern lately, other forms of criminal activity like cybercrime, sexual exploitation of children, environmental crime, and trafficking in cultural property are becoming a threat globally. The drugs market is undoubtedly the biggest market that we have to deal with. It has gone on the dark net, offering almost every class of drug for worldwide dispatch. Criminal finance has benefited greatly from technological innovation, such as the shift online. I've already talked about this. So a lot of money is laundered globally with no chances of successfully prosecuting those responsible, because the criminals are well connected. They are very smart, very intelligent. Like one of the speakers says, they actually commit their crimes by use of smart technology, smartphones. They commit crimes in air-conditioned offices. It is no longer your dirty, collared criminal. They are very extremely smart and very connected and dangerous most of the time. So we also have to grapple with crime, but at the same time with the security of prosecutors and investigators. What are the new tactics used by criminals? The first one that comes is concealing identity using technology. They do that all the time. A crime is committed and you can't seem to find anyone who has committed it. And most times you are left helpless, because some crimes are public interest crimes, some crimes affect our whole community, and sometimes crimes affect jurisdictions in the very shortest time. It has been committed in 10 countries. How do you do that? We're talking about MLA. We have to strengthen it. Dual nationality status is also a big gap. Someone was talking about making our, what is tying us down is the different legislations. And that's the weak link. That's what the criminals take advantage of. So maybe we could start things like that and say, let's have a law that runs across, starting with the region and beyond. A cashless economy, I don't need to go into this even any deeper. Non-cash payments have become the new normal, and this has increased vulnerability to fraud and crime. Cybercrime, I said crime is borderless. Many companies are being put on pressure by criminals because they want to protect their reputation. Penetration of state institutions and corruption. This is so common that you are running after an institution which is also corrupt is running after another institution. How do they do that? You can't do that if you're corrupt and you're running after criminals, which means you're compromised along the way. Children have been used as, I could say, for lack of a better word, human shields in committing crimes. There are many offenses. When I was still active in court, you find aggravated robbery, and you find a 12-year-old is among the 40-something-year-olds being charged together. So children are being used. And this is terrible for us because you're caught between prosecuting, and most times there is evidence only against the child. And then you can't prosecute this one if they are not above the age of criminal responsibility. And the case sometimes dies a natural death. But the victims of crime are there. You see them and you're helpless as a prosecutor. You can't do much. Recruitment of full-time professionals. Most of these criminals recruit the best lawyers, IT experts, even doctors. So that's what we are. And then there is, of course, illicit businesses that transcend cultural, social, linguistic, and geographical boundaries. Crime knows no boundaries now. International illegal markets originating from sale of illegal goods. Wherever there is a demand, are anonymous and more complex. We have illicit trafficking in firearms, trafficking in natural resources. During the 2 years of lockdown, we were locked down, but the criminals were not locked down. They just hit the roof. We are yet to come out of that and prosecute so many of those cases. Trafficking in persons has continued, and is affecting all of us. Many people are victims of identity theft. This makes investigation so difficult and so frustrating. So incarceration alone, I think, cannot work for crime now. The criminals, by the way, are lifestyle. By the time we get them, they've been at it for 20 years. So you're trying to break into someone who has done their job very, very well. So how do you do that? They even anticipate, they know how to forecast. That's why I'm saying that as prosecutors and investigators, maybe we should start forecasting crime. They forecast, they know that at one point, they will be caught, they will be prosecuted, and they will be sent to jail. So for them, jail is a given. They go there 5 years, 6 years, and their assets, their associates continue running their businesses. Actually, they can run the business behind bars. They come out after 10 years, their business has even grown. And moreover, some of our laws, when they're saying pay back the money you stole 10 years ago, we don't say pay with interest. You stole 10,000 5 years ago, that's what the court will say, pay back 10,000, which is terrible for us. Maybe we should be making them, that's why we are saying asset recovery is key as we do some of these crimes, human trafficking, environmental crimes. Let's do asset recovery because you hit the criminal really hard when you take their assets. You don't have to even to send them to jail, but take away their assets from their families, from their associates, from their girlfriends, from their boyfriends. I'm just going to run through, I don't know what time I have, Secretary General. I'll just run through very, very fast on the best practices. Of course, globally harmonizing legislation. This is a given, we must harmonize our legislation. Otherwise, I'll have a criminal running to Kenya, and then Kenya says, you're charging with murder, but you know, we don't have murder in our laws, so we can't extradite. Who does that? You see? Raising awareness among potential victims. People should know that this is how crime looks like. Sometimes they say some of the crimes are faceless, like corruption. They are faceless, they are victimless, that's in quotes. So you have to make people know that when the road is not worked well, it is corruption. So that because we depend on them. As the office of the DPP, you don't sit and manufacture cases. You actually depend on people to bring that evidence. Most of the time, they blame the prosecutors, they blame the investigators. But you have to throw it back to the public. You have to help us. If you report a case and you do not come to testify, that case dies. The DPP withdraws it. And they say that's all the DPP now does. Just sits there and withdraws cases. they don't know their duty. So we have to do that. We have to raise awareness. Maybe it will help us also prevent, instead of being on the end of only doing surgery, being in theater all the time. We should prevent crime. Law enforcement must embrace technology. This is a given. This is the 21st century. The crimes are all committed by use of some kind of technology, so we must embrace technology. Strategies to recover proceeds of crime. We must do this. We must make sure they don't benefit from what is not supposed to be theirs. We have to render assistance in absence of arrangements. If there's even no law at all, let's just offer assistance. That's how the criminals work. They don't even know each other, but they're well connected, they help each other. That's how we should actually move. And then rendering assistance in the absence of dual criminality. I've already talked about this. It doesn't have to be a crime in your country for you to give me assistance. And then, of course, MLA is a given. We must have mutual legal assistance. This is so important for information sharing. During the tea break, we were just talking about that we should actually be even having joint investigations and joint prosecutions. The DPP Mauritius can tell me, why don't you give me a prosecutor, a good prosecutor? There's a case, maybe a test case that we want to take to court. Or I can say, DPP South Africa, please send me one of your best prosecutors in asset recovery cases. Can we, in Uganda, I can actually appoint anyone to be a prosecutor and anyone to be an investigator for a case. So why don't we take advantage of such and have a case being prosecuted by prosecutors from 10 jurisdictions? The criminals will just, they will not like it, but we shall be the winners. Harmonization of laws, I've already talked about it. Embrace globalization, that's okay. Proper record keeping is so key. These criminals don't start, they have been at it for 10 years. They have been convicted in another jurisdiction. In my jurisdiction, every time a prosecutor, Adrian will tell you, John Bosco will tell you, every time the prosecutor, because of no record keeping, you're actually every time saying, this particular convict, my lord, is a first-time offender. And the person really looks very familiar. I prosecuted him 5 years ago, but because you have not kept records, every time they are a first-time offender. So that is so we should be able to keep proper records so that we get the best sentences out of that. And of course, continuous training and joint training should be key. We should train together with our investigators, train together with prosecutors, with judicial officers. My brother from the Court of Appeal will, of course, agree with me that judges say they don't train. So you should be able to remind them and have conversation with them. Because to tell the truth, there's nothing as frustrating as having a judge or a magistrate who doesn't understand your case. I've been a judge. When I don't understand the case, it is easier to acquit than to convict. So it is important for the judicial officers to understand your case so that they can actually be able to appreciate the case and give the right sentence. Someone said we are ministers of justice. Yes, we are ministers of justice. When we get convictions, we actually celebrate them. But we are also supposed to celebrate acquittals if the person is not guilty. Of course, human rights aspect must be respected. We have a law in Uganda which is almost tying our hands, because every time the person says, I was tortured in custody, and the case is supposed to actually stop, and you start investigating that. So in the process, what do you tell the victims of crime? Because a crime happened, even if the person was tortured in custody, but a crime happened. So we have to eliminate practical obstacles. We should avoid bureaucracy, yes, in 1 minute. That's why when you come to a conversation like this, even if you don't listen to my presentation, get a business card from the next person seated next to you. It is the best that you can ever take away from a place like this. That's why we missed this during the 2 years. Just to be able to talk to someone and have, it has magic. When you have a problem, you actually call immediately and say, in your country, how do I make a mutual legal assistance? And it is faster, right like this, and even they can offer to follow up for you. So this is a takeaway, and I want to conclude by saying that globalization and use of technology has made crime very complex, multifaceted. So we need to have a multi-sectoral approach. This is beautiful. This is what we need to do. Then we shall actually tame this monster of these emerging crimes. Thank you so much, SG. You're really looking at me. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. Hit the criminals, take their assets, harmonize legislation, and mutual assisting each other. Those are the key items of your presentation. I forgot to introduce Jane Abodo to you, but you all will know that she is the DPP for Uganda. And very important for me, she's also a member of the IAP Executive Committee. Very important. Okay, now we go to the 5 panelists. Taking this microphone and bring it to the panelists. Dear panelists, I would like to invite you all to elaborate on the topic, emerging crimes. Which one do you identify and what to do about it? Because the question all the participants want an answer on is what to do about those emerging crimes. The first one I will give the microphone is Mr. Mumba Mukomo. He was appointed in 2020 as the Prosecutor General of the Court of Cassation of the Democratic Republic of Congo after a long career from Advocate General to substitute to the Prosecutor General in 4 different Court of Appeals. Mr. Mumba, you have the floor for 5-6 minutes about.
Merci beaucoup. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Je voudrais remercier tout particulièrement mon frère, c'est plus facile de le dire comme ça, DPP du Kenya, qui m'a invité de participer à cette rencontre. Ça fait en fait la 2e fois que nous nous rencontrons avec lui. La première fois, c'était à Arusha. Je peux enlever le masque. Je disais que la première fois, c'était à Arusha que nous nous étions retrouvés avec lui. Et je crois que depuis ces temps-là, je l'ai particulièrement remarqué, ou que moi, je l'ai particulièrement remarqué, parce que j'ai comme l'impression qu'il y a quelques ressemblances entre lui et moi. Je lui ai laissé ma petite barbiche blanche, celui qui la porte désormais, mais j'ai comme l'impression qu'il est toujours sur mes pas, parce qu'il commence à développer aussi les cheveux blancs. Et donc je crois que sur ce plan-là, il me retrouvera très facilement. Je remercie aussi vous tous les participants à cette rencontre qui nous permet toujours encore une fois de plus de faire des échanges assez fructueux en ce qui concerne la répression de ces infractions émergentes, des crimes internationaux qui nécessitent que nous puissions mutualiser nos efforts, nos procédures, nos règles de loi pour que nous puissions arriver à bout, en tout cas que nous puissions réprimer assez sévèrement ces genres de crimes. Je ne voudrais pas m'étendre assez longuement sur ces notions de crimes émergents, crimes transnationaux que tout le monde connaît bien, mais il y a quand même un petit document qui a été élaboré pour ce faire et qui pourra facilement être consulté. mais je voudrais simplement plus parler de l'expérience que nous avons développée dans mon pays en matière de lutte contre ces genres de crimes. Et dans la lutte contre ce genre de crimes, nous avons plus particulièrement mis l'accent sur la manière de couper l'herbe sous les pieds de tous ces criminels. Et la seule bonne manière de couper l'herbe sous les pieds de ces criminels pour éviter qu'ils ne puissent proliférer dans leurs activités criminelles, c'est de leur priver du financement. S'ils n'ont pas de moyens qui leur permettent de financer leurs opérations, leurs activités, ils ne pourront pas proliférer. Lorsque, ainsi que je l'ai dit au départ, j'avais été appelé à prononcer un petit mot à Arusha en ce qui concerne les crimes phoniques, j'avais commencé par dire que la République démocratique du Congo, mon pays, était particulièrement connue comme étant un scandale géologique. J'avais tout de suite ajouté qu'il ne s'agissait pas seulement que de cela. Non seulement nous sommes un pays appelé scandale géologique sur le plan minéral, mais nous sommes aussi sur un pays qui est scandale phonique. Vous trouvez chez nous beaucoup de ces diversités, tant sur le plan de la faune que de la flore, qui sont en même temps contribuer au bon développement de notre planète. Mais aujourd'hui, en ce qui concerne le terrorisme aussi, je voudrais vous dire que nous sommes un pays de prédilection des terroristes. Tout simplement parce que nous sommes un pays au centre d'Afrique, et ce pays au centre de l'Afrique a plusieurs contacts avec d'autres pays qui sont nos pays amis avec lesquels nous partageons les frontières. Et dans ce pays, vous en avez dans lesquels se développent aujourd'hui les crimes de terrorisme comme, vous le savez tous, pour le moment, en République centrafricaine et d'autres pays encore qui nous sont frontaliers. Et le pays ayant une frontière, ayant les frontières qui sont parmi les frontières un peu poreuses, vous comprenez tout de suite que s'infiltrer dans notre pays pose souvent un peu moins de problèmes. Outre cela, avec le fait que nous avons la possibilité chez nous d'avoir plusieurs minerais et donc l'exploitation de ces minerais aussi nous attire des convoitises, et pour ceux naturellement qui veulent bien financer leurs activités criminelles, ils y trouvent un pays de prédilection pour y développer leurs activités et ainsi se faire suffisamment de moyens que pour continuer à développer leurs activités criminelles à travers le monde. C'est pour cette raison que mon pays a créé un certain nombre d'institutions pour lutter contre ces crimes et notamment particulièrement ce crime qui permet de couper l'herbe aux pieds du financement des terrorismes et d'autres crimes émergents, en créant la cellule des renseignements financiers, la cellule nationale des renseignements financiers. Outre cette cellule, nous en avons encore d'autres qui sont dans ce papier dont je parlais tout à l'heure et que vous pourrez aisément consulter. Mais présentement, cette cellule de renseignement financier, eu égard à un certain nombre d'éléments de faiblesse qui ont été détectés par ceux avec qui nous sommes en coopération, et notamment les États-Unis, la loi qui a créé cette cellule est en train d'être modifiée à ce jour pour plus de renforcement de ses capacités afin de mieux combattre encore le financement du terrorisme. La loi a été élaborée, envoyée au Parlement, et en l'envoyant au Parlement, il venait d'être accepté au niveau du Parlement et transmis à la commission administrative et juridique. Et de là, il devra être transmis au Sénat. C'est la procédure d'élaboration d'une loi organique. Et nous espérons qu'en définitive, cette loi pourra être adoptée pour que nous puissions être dotés d'un instrument plus efficace dans cette lutte-là. Mais un autre aspect, c'est que hier, lorsque nous nous étions retrouvés autour de la réception qui nous a été offerte à l'occasion de notre arrivée ici, nous étions avec madame qui me regarde si bien là-bas du Maroc, en train de rigoler un peu sur tout ce qu'on appelle 10 pipis ici. On a trouvé qu'il y en avait tellement 10 pipis, 10 pipis, 10 pipis. Mais chez moi, dans mon pays aussi, vous trouvez beaucoup de procureurs généraux, malheureusement. À la suite du fait que notre Cour suprême de justice a éclaté pour donner 3 juridictions, à savoir la Cour constitutionnelle, naturellement avec à ses côtés un parquet général près cette Cour, la Cour de cassation avec près cette juridiction le procureur général que je suis, et le Conseil d'État avec à ses côtés le procureur général près le Conseil d'État. Et en dessous de moi viennent des procureurs généraux près le cour d'appel. Et pour le moment, je crois que nous en comptons une vingtaine, plus de 27 à 28 cours d'appel à travers le pays. De telle sorte que un justiciable serait-il pris pour un crime émergent quelconque, pour un crime de terrorisme, il sera traduit devant la juridiction devant laquelle il est compétent, qui est compétent pour connaître des faits qui lui sont reprochés. Ce sera soit devant une cour d'appel, soit devant un tribunal de grande instance, soit, et dans de très rares cas, devant moi, c'est-à-dire devant la Cour de cassation. Et vous comprenez qu'avec ce genre de système, il y a plus de chances que certains criminels puissent se passer dans les maillons de la justice, dans la mesure où ces gens disposant de beaucoup de moyens, s'ils se retrouvent au niveau le plus bas, il est plus facile pour eux de manœuvrer à ce niveau-là et d'arriver à se tirer d'affaire que s'ils étaient au niveau du sommet. Et là encore, je l'espère, que c'est une question qui pourra être résolue par la loi. Et je voudrais donc terminer par un petit exemple qui nous interpelle tous. Ce pourquoi nous sommes ici, c'est-à-dire mutualiser nos efforts, mutualiser toutes les énergies que nous avons pour combattre ces genres de crimes qui sont commis par des gens qui sont hyper bien organisés. Nous avons un défi chez nous tel que, aujourd'hui, vous avez d'un côté ceux qui vous demandent, dans le cadre de l'amélioration du climat des affaires, de faire en sorte que les règles en rapport avec la constitution d'une société puissent être quelque peu simplifiées, de telle sorte que vous puissiez constituer votre société en 48 heures, 72 heures tout au plus. Et pour cela, vous ne voyez même plus physiquement les personnes qui veulent constituer cette société. Ils le font par voie électronique, ils s'adressent à telle institution et à telle autre, et ils obtiennent tous leurs papiers comme ça, sans qu'on les ait vus au départ. Vous allez donc retrouver une société qui a été créée avec comme responsable une autre société qui est installée aux îles Maurice Et cette société crée une autre société chez moi. Et lorsque vous avez des problèmes avec une société comme celle-là, même de façon préventive, sans que vous n'ayez fait quoi que ce soit, mais vous voulez simplement vous enquérir pour savoir cette société qui est installée, qui a créé une autre installée ici, appartient à qui ou est composée de quel genre de personnes. Lorsque je requiers mon collègue des îles Maurice pour qu'il me prête main forte afin de savoir la telle société qui est créée chez lui, à qui comme responsable, à qui comme associé, mais il faudrait que le collègue puisse me répondre assez plus rapidement, plutôt que de devoir repasser par les mécanismes classiques de la transmission de nos commissions rogatoires internationales, comme nous l'avons déjà si bien dit lorsque nous nous retrouvons. C'est-à-dire la facilité des moyens de coopération entre les organes de poursuite que nous sommes pour répondre à ce genre de questions sans devoir attendre que la question vous soit parvenue par la voie officielle normale, ministère de la Justice de chez moi vers les affaires étrangères de chez vous les affaires étrangères, ministère de la Justice, et pour que avec toute cette longue procédure, il y a des risques que ces gens-là ayant beaucoup de ramifications, que dans le cheminement de la question que j'ai posée, elle puisse se retrouver entre les mains d'un de ceux qui sont amis ou proches aux constituants de cette société. De sorte que les traces, l'action peut ainsi rester anéantie. D'où la nécessité de devoir, encore une fois de plus, trouver des mécanismes pour que nous puissions commencer à élaborer des procédures, même en interne, entre nous-mêmes, organes de poursuite, pour que mon ami du Rwanda en sait quelque chose. Il a eu déjà à parler de cela lorsque nous nous étions retrouvés à Arusha, pour qu'entre nous, nous trouvions des solutions assez facilement. C'est vrai que d'un côté, il faudra que nous tenions compte toujours de nos amis avocats avec les droits de l'homme aujourd'hui. On vous dira, mais vous avez reçu cette réponse, comment ça, ce n'est pas passé par la voie officielle, ce n'est pas... Mais au moins, nous trouverons toujours des moyens pour faire en sorte que, en tant qu'officier du ministère public, en tant qu'organe de poursuite, nous pouvons toujours trouver des moyens pour répondre assez efficacement à ce genre de questions, mais entre-temps, nous aurons résolu une question qui aurait permis peut-être de mettre en péril beaucoup de vies, si pas l'État carrément. Voilà, bien chers dames et messieurs, organes de poursuite et autres qui est ici dans la salle, j'espère que à la prochaine occasion, je pourrai être valablement compté comme membre participant à cette organisation, parce qu'il était même déjà question lors de la première fois que je sois membre, mais j'avais demandé qu'il me soit donné les statuts de l'organisation pour que je puisse préalablement les examiner et voir comment je pourrais y adhérer. Si ça pouvait être fait, j'aurais pu, séance tenante, payer ma participation, mais évidemment, les soupçons de terrorisme sont tels que je ne pouvais pas amener du cash moi-même. Ça va venir par la voie bancaire à laquelle nous faisons encore confiance. Ce sera donc quelque chose qui sera à être fait d'ici là. Je vous remercie une fois de plus, surtout pour vous qui ne parlez pas anglais. Je vois que vous aussi, vous avez porté les casques, comme moi j'en porte tout le temps. Merci beaucoup, et je crois que nous aurons l'occasion de nous retrouver encore.
Thank you, Mr. Mumba. A broad range of challenges, counterterrorism, natural resources, wildlife, but Mr. Mumba underlined international cooperation and good legislation. The next speaker, and I kindly ask Mr. Mumba to give the microphone to Mrs. Serena Curry. who currently works with the Department of Justice in the United States, the Office of the International Affairs, more specifically the US Central Authority, working on international cooperation to extradition and on mutual legal assistance in East Africa and other regions of the world. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I will keep the formalities quite short. I am very grateful to the organizers, to the International Association of Prosecutors, etc., and particularly, of course, to the Director of Public Prosecutions here in Kenya for hosting us in this lovely, lovely location. And I'm also very grateful for the opportunity to meet all of you. I am not a Director of Public Prosecutions. I am not an Attorney General yet, but it is, as I said, it is a serious honor for me to be here to speak with you all today. I hope that we can get to know each other better through this conference and that I can help you get the information that you need from the United States and also that we can build our relationships such that the United States can obtain the evidence and fugitives that it needs from your countries as well. As my colleague mentioned, I represent the Central Authority of the United States, which is in the Department of Justice. I am in the Office of International Affairs. We are housed in the same department in the United States as our prosecutions, as our prosecutors. So it's a unique setup, I guess, or framework in the United States, in that we have our it's essentially our Ministry of Justice and our Directorate of Public Prosecutions in one entity, which facilitates our relationships with amongst our colleagues. And my office can serve as a resource to both the range of domestic and federal, state and federal prosecutors, as well as to our partners abroad. I just want to speak briefly about international cooperation and the importance of central authorities in that. I know that we have mentioned international cooperation several times throughout the conference. I think perhaps every speaker has indicated that the new transnational crime necessitates better international cooperation. I would agree wholeheartedly. I would note that in practice, international cooperation can mean many different things. There is the informal cooperation that is obtained through conversations here in this forum and forums like it, the partnership and camaraderie that facilitates the execution of requests and the assistance that is required to and from our respective countries. There is also, of course, cooperation among law enforcement directly, in terms of information sharing of resources and mechanisms of detecting and preventing crime. And then finally, and perhaps most important to my office, is the formal mechanisms of cooperation. I understand that these can take a long time, which is why I think it is very, very important to support and strengthen the central authorities in our respective countries. This is because the central authority can serve as a unifying force in each of our countries to facilitate cooperation and serve as a single point of contact for our colleagues abroad. So, for example, if my colleague from Egypt requires data from a social media company in the United States, for example, where does he go? He goes to my office. My office then farms that request out to the relevant prosecutors in the relevant locations in our country, obtains the information through those prosecutors, and then provides it back directly to the Egyptian counterpart. The other, when we obtain information from other countries, it comes through my office as well. Our federal and state prosecutors seek evidence from for a case, within their jurisdiction. Their jurisdiction has particular requirements for how evidence may be admitted into court. And so they go through my office. I obtain the evidence they need for their case from my counterparts here in this room. But I obtain it in a manner that is readily admissible into evidence, meaning it is authenticated, it is certified, it is credible, and, as I said, readily admissible. So, you know, this kind of cooperation, as we all know, it can take a while. It can, you know, insofar as it has to go from the prosecutor to the MOJ to the MFA, it can be frustrating. I understand that. However, if we work cooperatively within our countries and within our various ministries, we will be able to facilitate and effectuate and make more efficient that process. I think the strong sort of central authorities that are mandated by many of our bilateral mutual legal assistance treaties, by many of our multilateral conventions that include mutual assistance provisions, like the UN Transnational Organized Crime Convention, like the UN Convention Against Corruption. All of these require the designation of a central authority. And that central authority is supposed to be a single point of contact and an assistant to all of our partners in the world. And so, you know, in short, because I know we are running tight on time, and I don't want to impose further, but I do think that the formal cooperation is a mechanism that we do need to remember. We have the means of using it already in place. We do not need to create new legislation for this. We have the conventions, we have our bilateral treaties. We can do this as long as we sort of facilitate that communication, right? If we can communicate directly, central authority to central authority, if we can facilitate those relationships and build those relationships internally to our respective countries as well as around the world like this, I think we'll be strengthened, and we can further our prosecutions and our mutual interests in combating the transnational crime epidemic that we are seeing today. I will leave it there for now. I really, again, appreciate your time and attendance, and I look forward to meeting many of you individually throughout the conference. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Khoury. And I hope you heard her well when she said, I offer you the assistance and the cooperation of my department in fighting crime together with you here in Africa. Thank you so much. I'll keep the order of the program, and the third panelist is Mrs. Tomica Stevens-Patterson, resident legal advisor from the Department of Justice, United States, the Office of Overseas Prosecutorial Development, Assistance and Training. She's based here in Nairobi, Kenya, since 2018 after a 13-year career of Assistant U.S. Attorney in Pennsylvania. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I know we're right before lunch, but can we have another good afternoon? Good afternoon. All right. Well, it is a real honor and a pleasure to be here. I am coming up to the end of my tenure here in Kenya, and I want to say a special thank you to the Director of Public Prosecution for inviting me here today, along with the IAP and the EAAP. As our moderator indicated, I am a prosecutor from the United States, so I sit in the same seats as all of you, struggling, trying to figure out how you address all of these complex and emerging crimes. And I think one thing that I've heard repeatedly from the opening remarks and throughout is that crime is ever evolving, criminals are ever evolving, and it's becoming more complex, more technologically driven. But I want to use my time this morning to emphasize that what we do as prosecutors when we are trying to figure out how to successfully bring these cases to successful resolution doesn't really change all that dramatically. And I think it's important to emphasize some of those best practices that we can do as prosecutors that can apply in the simplest cases, but they apply equally in the more complex cases that we are here discussing over the next couple of days. And the success of prosecutions, I think, is driven by decisions that are made across the various stages of a case. That the decisions you make as a prosecutor, they don't start when you are prosecuting the case. There are decisions that are made at the investigative stage, at the charging stage, at the pre-trial stage, and at the trial stage that is going to help you successfully get justice in all of these various different emerging crime areas. So I just want to highlight a couple of practices that we have used in the United States and as part of our efforts through the criminal division at the U.S. Department of Justice, we have various offices across the world, and in particular in various places throughout Africa, where we want to share those best practices. So I'm excited to be here this morning to highlight a few of those. First and foremost, at the investigative stage, I think one of the key ways in which we as prosecutors can really grapple with and come up with better strategies for handling emerging crimes is getting involved with the cases as early as possible. And I know it is always a challenge to respect the mandates of your investigators, and you also want your investigators to respect the mandates that you have as prosecutors. But what we have found in these very complex cases is that the involvement of a prosecutor early on in the case is going to allow for the best evidence to be developed as quickly as possible, for that evidence to be preserved in the most effective way that will be admissible within court, and you're able to recognize those gaps that really have to be filled in order for you to get a successful prosecution. Second, as it has been mentioned in by multiple speakers and by Ms. Cowrie before me, you have to consider and utilize international cooperation efforts. And understanding what those efforts are and working closely with your law enforcement partners is really critical in the process. And for emerging crimes, we know that there are no borders. There's nothing stopping them from committing a crime in the US is gonna require some use of resources in other countries. And if we come to accept that as the reality, it means that we have to do a better job working across countries in order to better connect with one another. So I wanna just emphasize that for the US, we have law enforcement partners that are in various countries throughout the world that are either situated in your country or they are serving in a regional capacity. Those individuals are there to provide assistance, helping you to figure out how best to utilize all of the international resources that are available. Additionally, plea bargaining has become a very effective tool that we've been using in the US, not just to resolve cases, because I think everyone thinks about plea bargaining in the US. We resolve about 97 to 98% of our cases at the federal level through plea bargaining. But plea bargaining also allows you to develop cooperators who will give you information about the terrorist networks and how they operate. What are the different ways in which criminals are developing these business enterprises and using these technologies to hide their assets and to make them more successful at achieving their criminal proceeds. So So plea bargaining allows prosecutors and law enforcement to learn as much as possible about all of these criminal networks. And I think that that's something that plea bargaining is something that is available in many of your countries. But it's all about implementing it, implementing those tools, and utilizing that information so that you can better target these criminal enterprises. And finally, at the investigative stage, you really got to follow the money, because following the money gets at what our presenter hit at, which I think is so critically important to re-emphasize. Criminals are going to be ready to go to jail, but going after their assets cuts their legs off. And so it's really important that as prosecutors, at the investigative stage, you are working closely with your law enforcement partners to really figure out where the finances are, where the assets are, and being able to go after them as quickly and as efficiently as possible. One of the things we do in the US when we are charging cases is we are always looking at our available forfeiture statutes. How can we forfeit as many assets as possible? And so I think the panel later in the conference that's focusing on asset recovery is so critically important. Understanding what all of those procedures are that are available to you as prosecutors, or working with your partner agencies. Maybe an asset recovery agency sits under the Attorney General's office, as it does here in Kenya, so that you're going after it civilly while you're also going after assets on the criminal side. So turning to charging, I just want to raise three sort of practices that I think are really critical for when you're thinking about how to charge these very complex emerging cases. First and foremost, as prosecutors, we always have to remember that there has to be sufficient evidence to charge a case. But one of the practices that we use at the U.S. Attorney's offices is we don't charge cases simply on just enough evidence to get past that arrest stage. You gotta have sufficient evidence to prove the case at trial. It's a higher standard, but it's an important standard to have, because the last thing you want to do is charge a case because you have just enough evidence, but then the case falls apart once you start going through the trial process. Justice requires that we as prosecutors make very tough decisions. And probably one of the toughest decisions that we often have to make is the decision not to charge. And so working with law enforcement on the front end, and also making sure we are applying the highest standard possible when we are assessing the evidence presented is so critically important. And second, one of the things that I think also becomes a challenge with these emerging crimes is that they cannot be resolved quickly. They're complex. They're going to take more time, more energy, more resources. So it's important that we as prosecutors also recognize the importance of taking your time to analyze those cases, to make sure that you have all the evidence there to help fill the gaps where evidence doesn't exist, to help develop a theory of your case that can easily be presented to the court. And then finally, at the charging stage, I think it's also critically important that you're always thinking about cooperation. You're always thinking about developing those sources to help you build a case. And those sources might not necessarily be in the country that you are in. So it's about also identifying those sources of cooperation in other countries that are going to help build your case. And then turning to the pretrial decision stage, I think one of the most difficult aspects of these emerging crimes is because they're so complex. As prosecutors, you have to make some critical decisions about how evidence is presented and the way in which you present it. One of the speakers talked about how, you've got to make sure that the judges that you present in front of, the court you present in front of, really understands all of these emerging areas. And you have to think very carefully about that. One of the things about cases like this is you often are going to have witnesses coming from different countries. And you have to think carefully about when you present those witnesses and even how you present those witnesses. You are working in an area where these crimes are committed by criminals who honestly are ready to commit crimes against the very victims that they're using. They're much more dangerous. They are more prone to witness tampering and destruction of evidence. So I think it's also critically important that as prosecutors, when we are looking at these drug trafficking cases and child trafficking cases, cases where they are victim heavy, you've got to think about security issues. You must always think about the security of your witnesses and relying on the various witness protection strategies that are available in your countries. But as prosecution services, it's also important that you are looking within your own office and utilizing your own resources to develop those witness protection strategies when there might be a gap. Maybe your witness protection agency or the equivalent are lacking in resources to help protect the witnesses that you are serving. So you, as prosecution services, and all the DPPs that are here, it's how do you develop those strategies within your own office to help protect your very witnesses? And also, I think it's important that you think outside of the box when you are prosecuting cases involving some of these very complex matters. When you are presenting a case to the judge, you've got to find a way to simplify. As our presenter said this at the very beginning of this session, it's easier for a court to simply acquit if they just don't understand. So it's critically important that you are summarizing the evidence, that you are utilizing charts and stipulations to help the judges get to the essential points. And these issues of emerging issues are very technologically heavy. I will admit I probably have been to about 4 or 5 trainings about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and blockchain, and I still to this day cannot explain to you how it works. Hopefully the session tomorrow is going to open up some eyes as to how that works. But you have to be able to understand these technological advances and find ways to simplify it for the court. And then finally, when you get to the trial stage, there is, I think, one practice that we use in the US that often is not used in various countries, in Africa in particular, that I think is so critically important. And while you as prosecution services may not have control over this, it is important that there are discussions amongst your criminal justice sector agencies, particularly the courts, about its importance. And that's the use of consecutive hearing dates, consecutive trials. It is very important that when addressing emerging crimes, that you get justice for your victims quickly. It gives a sense of comfort to your communities that you're taking these crimes seriously and that you're going to combat them in a quick manner. It's always challenging when you have a terrorism case that starts and doesn't conclude for 8 years or 10 years. And that gives a sense of, or creates a lack of confidence within your prosecution services. So trying ways of getting cases through the system as quickly as possible is so critically important. And then I will end on just one note. One note.
Just one note.
Because I think it's an important point to raise. And that's that it's our role as prosecutors to do justice. But justice does not mean justice at all cost. It was, I think, extremely important to have Eric Thury, the president of the Law Society of Kenya, here this morning, because human rights and constitutional rights are critically important. And while as prosecutors we want to get those convictions, we want to get some sense of success and a sense of closure for our victims and for our communities, it's important to recognize that the practices that we use, the policies we have in place, still have to be consistent with our various constitutions and recognizing the importance of human rights. And so I just want to emphasize that in my closing, because as we talk to one another and engage with one another and find ways to better cooperate to more successfully prosecute emerging crimes, it's important to also share those aspects of what we do that could be inconsistent with constitutional provisions and human rights provisions, and making sure that we are recognizing that and taking active steps as prosecutors not to violate those procedures and policies that are in place. You can help each other get better at your jobs and work more cooperatively by sharing those challenges as well as those success stories. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Stevens-Patterson. You underlined our burden as prosecutors. Fighting crime is getting more and more challenging, more technical also. And you stressed that with respect to your investigators, but whatever judicial system you have, get involved as soon as possible. Use your broad range of judicial possibilities. Don't go the standard ways. Be creative and protect your witnesses. Those were very important words from Mrs. Stevens-Patterson. And now I get to the next panelist, which is Mr. Sandro Donati. Mr. Sandro Donati has been serving since 2018 as Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Officer within the TOC-CT team of UNODC Eastern Africa, coordinating the Great Lakes Judicial Cooperation Network, as well as enhancing international cooperation in criminal matters of the Better Immigration Management Program. You have the floor. Otherwise, I give you mine. I'll give you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm glad and very much honored to be here and have this opportunity to speak in front of this audience. I would like to thank ODPP Kenya for the invitation and for the continued partnership with UNODC. As many speakers have highlighted previously, several regions in Africa, Eastern Africa, but also West Africa and Northern Africa are faced with several challenges related to transnational organized crime, illicit trafficking, terrorism, smuggling of migrants, and many are the challenges also in terms of international cooperation in criminal matters. Many mentioned about the lack of cooperation mechanisms, the lack of trust, but also language barriers, diversity of legal systems. My presentation today is not too technical, and it's not a presentation related to the institutions of mutual legal assistance and extradition themselves, but the scope is to present some solutions that UNODC have put forward in order to strengthen the capacities of member states in countering transnational organized crime and reinforce cooperation mechanisms and procedures. As you may know, UNODC has the mandate to support the member states in countering these crimes and supports all relevant practitioners in the criminal justice chain to detect, investigate and prosecute these crimes and aims at reinforcing the international cooperation perspective. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. no, sorry, the previous one. Yes. So I'm now introducing an initiative that has been implemented for the first time by the Unodc Regional Office for West Africa through the Promise Project. It's an initiative that has its legal ground in Article 18, Paragraph 13 of the United Nations Convention against Transnational Organized Crime, which is about strengthening the role of the central authorities. And it's an initiative that aims at strengthening judicial cooperation to tackle trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants through the deployment of liaison magistrates. The initiative is contributing to the achievement of the recommendation number 4 of Niamey Declaration, and was signed by Italy and the WACAP Prosecution Network in 2018. Next slide, please. So back in February 2018, Italy and Nigeria signed an agreement based on which Italy requested prosecution expert from Nigeria to work in close contact with the Italian authorities. The prosecutor was deployed in February 2018 and started working on a rotational basis with several prosecutors in south of Italy, who were actually those ones who made the request. The deployment entailed some travels from Italy and back to Nigeria, and from Nigeria and back to Italy to follow up on the mutual legal assistance requests. And after a few months of deployment, we could see the results of the deployment. There was a lot of cooperation among the relevant central authorities from Italy and Nigeria on MLA cases. And given the success of the first year of deployment, another prosecutor from Nigeria was then deployed to Spain to support the authorities in Spain on cases related to smuggling of migrants, mostly trafficking and smuggling of migrants, flows coming from Western Africa to Europe. Next slide, please. So what is the role of the liaison magistrate in this initiative? So mainly overcoming all those challenges, all those barriers that we have mentioned before, and therefore providing legal and practical advice to authorities of the countries with regard to the respective legal and procedural requirement. Also shortening the channels of communication through a constant follow-up on formal requests for mutual legal assistance and extradition, but also very much providing his or her background and knowledge about criminal groups. At the time, the Nigerian prosecutor was very much helpful to the Italian authorities, providing key information regarding criminal groups who were operating in Italy at the time, as well as transferring file on organized crimes from one country to another and solicit the prompt follow-up from the relevant central authorities. And of course, in the same vein as we were discussing before, the importance of building trust, which is the most important ingredient when it comes to international cooperation in criminal matters. So the prosecutor activated a direct channel of communication between Italy and the authorities in Nigeria. And before the deployment, we analyzed all the opportunities to make sure that the Italian authorities, both prosecuting and law enforcement authorities, could actually get in touch with the prosecutor to better coordinate on the investigations. Next slide, please. So how does the communication work? In this specific case, the European member state, the Italian prosecution office, submitted a request for legal cooperation through the African liaison expert, who then provided the relevant background on the criminal networks in the country of origin and activated this line of communication with the national prosecuting authorities and investigative authorities. UNODC served to support the request for legal cooperation. Through the UNODC field office, we could follow up on the request that was made to the Nigerian authorities, but also providing substantive capacity building on trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants where this was needed. Next slide, please. So these are the conditions of the deployment. UNODC acted as a facilitator for the deployment, basically providing technical, logistical and financial support, as well as substantive assistance. One thing that is worth to mention is that the liaison magistrate continues to maintain his or her prosecution powers and to depend on the Ministry of Justice of the deploying country during the deployment, meaning that the liaison magistrate acts de facto as a central authority, competent central authority within the deployed country. When it comes to the duration, length of the deployment, this is very much depending on the investigative needs, but also on the funds available. We started with a first deployment of 6 weeks in the host country, 2 weeks in the deploying country. Other prosecutors were deployed afterwards following the success of the first initiative. We had a prosecutor from Ethiopia, one prosecutor from Eritrea, who were also deployed to Italy for a short time. Next slide, please. In September 2019, we held a multi-stakeholder meeting in Italy just right before the deployment of the 2 Eastern African prosecutors to discuss about the results, gaps and challenges encountered, and to reflect on the possible way forward. Just gonna go to the next slide, please. It was recommended that we could adopt in the future a longer-term perspective in the selection and assignment of the liaison magistrates. As you know, international cooperation is a lot about building trust. So it is very challenging for someone who has never been in a specific country to arrive there and to be embedded in the central authority from the first time and from the first moment, and therefore it takes time for the prosecutors to then effectively support the hosting authorities. And therefore, this is recommendations that was made by Italy at the time to UNODC to promote a longer-term deployment, but also considering expanding this initiative both geographically and in its scope. We were discussing with colleagues the other day about how we can make this initiative more effective, because these aims at reinforcing what we have mentioned here in the panel before, formal cooperation as well as informal cooperation. We were discussing with colleagues about the opportunity, for instance, to adopt the same model, but to adopt it at the regional level. So this is an opportunity, for instance, that we could explore with countries in the region through also the Eastern Africa Association of Prosecutors on how we can best assist you with a more operational approach than a theoretical approach. And this is very much what we are aiming at in our next project. One of the projects I'm working on is called Better Migration Management Program, and is actually supported by the European Union Trust Fund. And we have trained all prosecuting authorities central authorities in the region for the last few years, and now discussing with the donors and with our partners, we want to shift towards a more operational approach. So this is an initiative that could be helpful, not just in looking at reinforcing the relationships between African countries and European countries, but also look at the regional perspective. Next slide, please. I'm just going to give briefly the results that this initiative achieved. So 5 liaison magistrates were deployed since 2018. 6 countries were involved: Niger, Nigeria, Italy, Spain, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. Now the initiative is governed by a memorandum of understanding, and it is now in the process of being drafted, a new memorandum of understanding between Niger and Italy to better define the requirements of the deployment. 61 cases were facilitated, 41 cases of trafficking, 1 of smuggling, 6 cases of trafficking and smuggling, and 13 related other crimes. 1 request for extradition transmitted, 29 mutual legal assistance requests sent, and 4 fugitives arrested. Next slide. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I'd like to thank you and to reiterate that Unodc stands ready to support the EAP and the relevant member states. This is a very practical initiative that we can offer, and I hope that you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Donati. You emphasized the international cooperation by explaining the liaison magistrate initiative based on the UNTAC treaty to be arranged between the respective UNTAC countries to assist each other with legal and practical advice, all supported by Unodc. And might you have any questions about this initiative, Mr. Donati will be glad to talk to you during the breaks. Then, last but not least, Mrs. Norhan Tumun, as Associate Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Officer specialized in trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants, working with Unodc Eastern Africa. You have the floor.
Thank you. Is this working? Yes, you can hear me well. Okay. Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon, bon après-midi, salam masana. These are the languages I know for now. And as I'm looking at all of you, I see that you're either in need of your 2nd or 3rd cup of coffee, or you're daydreaming about your samosas for lunch. So I'll be very quick and brief. So today I'm going to talk about enhancing regional cooperation, and essentially I want to get out of this presentation with one idea, which I want you to discuss in your deliberations today, and it's about enhancing regional cooperation on organized crime more broadly, but trafficking in a specific manner. And essentially what I want to get out of this presentation, and you'll see as I go through the slides, is that I want you to capitalize on this. Essentially what we have here today. Capitalize on these connections, build on these connections through formal and informal channels to effectively detect, investigate, and prosecute organized crimes, transnational organized crimes, and trafficking in persons. Thank you, Michael, for helping me with the slides. Okay, so on the international legal framework, and here I'm going to highlight that Justice Jean also mentioned on the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And it's the main international legal framework that governs organized crime. This convention, as well as its supplementing protocols on trafficking, smuggling, and firearms, they have a lot of tools that help member states effectively detect and investigate those crimes. So utilize the tools that are in these conventions. And again, finally, I'm not going to bore you with the law today, but on the Organized Crime Convention, utilize the tools. If you haven't ratified the convention or the protocols, I really urge you to do so. Okay. So the Organized Crime Convention, why did it come into force? These are one of the most widely ratified United Nations treaties with almost universal adherence. So almost all of the countries, or most of the countries that are present here today and the representatives, your countries have ratified these conventions. But why is it the most widely ratified convention? Because all of the countries realize the negative impact that transnational organized crime has on your country's economy, on your country's peace, security, and human rights as well. And the reason that all of you are here today discussing transnational organized crime is because you also realize that not one single country, no matter how powerful it is, can combat organized crime on its own. And that also applies to trafficking in persons. Michael, if you can help me with the next slide, please. So as UNODC staff whose role is to support member states in preventing and suppressing trafficking in persons, essentially what I do, one question I have been regularly asked across the region when I do workshops and so on is, do you think the pandemic has increased or decreased trafficking in persons? And I technically never give a yes or no answer. Trafficking remains a largely hidden crime, with perpetrators working in the dark corners of the internet to exploit individuals. So the pandemic has actually forced these perpetrators to go underground. That doesn't necessarily mean that trafficking has decreased, but it means that the perpetrators shifted their operations online. And that essentially adds to what Justice Jane and many of the previous speakers have said. We've seen a rise in online exploitation, online trafficking, and the use of internet to further organized crime. Next slide, please. Okay. UNODC has done a study on COVID and its effects on trafficking in persons. And what I want to highlight is the last 2 points here is that during COVID, the recruitment and exploitation moved online. And these are two essential elements of trafficking in persons, and all of you know that as prosecutors. So the exploitation, the recruitment when it comes to trafficking moved online. And you can see these through regular platforms that you use on a daily basis, whether it's Instagram or TikTok. Trafficking is actively happening on some of these platforms. And there's a need for police to actually go through these platforms, identify the trafficking indicators and so on, to be able to catch some of these criminals. Next slide, please. Okay, so remember the question I just asked about whether trafficking increased or decreased. It's possible to argue that, yes, well, airports were closed and mobility was limited, so this kind of halted trafficking or decreased it a bit. But not necessarily, because like mentioned from all of the previous speakers, the traffickers, who are in most cases part of larger organized criminal groups, they are super smart. They are always one step ahead of us. And they took advantage of the lockdown. They changed their traditional means, shifted their businesses online, making it very difficult to detect and protect victims as well. Crime thrives in times of crises, and traffickers quickly adapted to the new normal. They responded to the closure of bars, clubs, massage parlors where trafficking regularly occurs by simply moving their illegal business either online or to private properties as well. With this, countries have seen a rise in online sexual exploitation generally, and especially that of children staying at home during times of COVID when schools were out, and using social media platforms as well. So during the several workshops that I have, we've had concerns from a number of countries, including Mauritius as well, on the issue of sexual exploitation and online sexual exploitation of children. And I know Mauritius as well has proposed a number of child protection legislation that's in favor of child protection to address these crimes as well. But what I want to show you here is how organized crime, transnational organized crime, and specifically within that trafficking in person, is super complex. It requires a comprehensive, multi-dimensional approach to combat this crime. And I stole this from Justice Jane. So next slide, please. Okay. So the UNODC Global Trafficking in Persons report, which is issued almost annually, showed some of the trafficking in persons flows. And as you can see, sub-Saharan Africa, including Eastern Africa, it has both origin and destination countries, with heavy flows to Middle Eastern and potentially GCC countries as well for forced labor. So there's a specific need on enhancing and strengthening regional coordination, as well as inter-regional cooperation on organized crime, including trafficking in persons. Next slide, please, Mike. Okay. So as UNODC, we've been working across the Eastern Africa region and 13 member states. And I'm going to specifically talk about my role, which is combating trafficking in persons. So our role is to support member states in strengthening detection, investigation, and prosecution of trafficking in persons cases. And we do this in multiple ways. One is to strengthen the national legislative frameworks, align it with the International Legal Convention, UNODC, and the supplementary protocols. Two is enhancing the capacity of national counterparts on investigation and prosecution techniques. Three, which is very important for me here, is strengthening regional coordination and, of course, international cooperation as well on organized crime. So these three, for me, work hand in hand to suppress and prevent trafficking in persons and to also suppress more broadly organized crime. So I facilitated workshops and conferences across the region, and when you actually listen to the people that are working on the ground, the prosecutors, the investigators, the frontline officers, the immigration, the people that are actively working on preventing and suppressing trafficking in persons, they'll tell you that there's a definite need for regional cooperation on these cases. And I'll give you an example of that in a second. Sometimes when I have a conference with some of the criminal justice practitioners across Eastern Africa, they tell you, well, the law is the problem. We have gaps in the law. We need to strengthen the law. Okay, perfect. And then when we talk to prosecutors or have workshops with prosecutors, we hear, well, we need the police and immigration people to talk to us more. We need evidence, and whoops, sometimes your witness just gets deported and your case completely falls apart. And I know a lot of you have this challenge as prosecutors. A lot of times you have potential victims that flew, let's say, from Ethiopia to Kenya or country X to country Y, but you don't have all the information or evidence to build your case. You need support from X or Y countries. Again, cooperation. By the time you draft, and I'm going to build off of the formal channels that my colleagues emphasized in international cooperation, they've also emphasized one challenge, is that the formal requests on international cooperation do take time, for sure. And by the time you draft the MLA request, sometimes the victim might have reached the country of destination, and it is tricky. But it's important to capitalize on both formal and informal channels. You utilizing formal channels doesn't take away from having these connections, discussing informally, trying to push for the diplomatic channels to open up. So yes, there's a need for both formal and informal channels, but also what needs to happen is that all of you here are regularly connected, that you catalyze on this platform to actually work on cases together, to actually detect cases, to actually prosecute perpetrators or that are part of larger organized criminal groups. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of this, but these are some of the challenges that we face in terms of detecting, investigating, and prosecuting transnational organized crime cases, and specifically trafficking here. And one of the main challenges that countries fail to recognize is that trafficking in persons rarely occurs as a crime on its own. Rarely occurs as a standalone crime. And I know that you as prosecutors recognize this the most. It doesn't happen, the trafficking case doesn't present itself, all the elements are happening in the same country, you have the case ready in front of you, ready to prosecute, and you're good to go. It doesn't happen that way. It actually happens with elements of the crime happening in different countries, evidences in Kenya, a part of the evidences in Ethiopia. And again, emphasizing the need for regional cooperation and international cooperation as well. So trafficking, because it rarely happens on its own, it will almost always be connected to other organized crimes. So I'm just going to give an example of, let's say, victim is trafficked. So sexual exploitation or sex trafficking happens on a boat off the shore somewhere, okay? If the police get a tip that there is evidence that, or tip that sex trafficking is happening on a boat somewhere in the country, they go and then they find the potential victim that they're looking for, but they will most likely also find drugs potentially relating to drug trafficking. If they trace back the money, they might find money laundering information as well. And something that I want to mention, which I think hasn't been discussed, is the nexus or the connection between trafficking in persons with terrorism. So a lot of the terrorist groups right now utilize trafficking in persons as a way to push their operations forward, as a way to increase their operation. So that's why tackling trafficking is a way to disrupt the operations of terrorist organizations as well. So that's an important point to mention. So again, trafficking doesn't happen on its own, not just trafficking, but all of the organized crime or transnational organized crime. They're almost always connected. And you as prosecutors have the difficulty of facing this complex crime. And this is why all of you need that extra push of regional, international cooperation. You need to talk to people in other countries. You need that extra piece of intelligence to put your case together. Traffickers have multiple streams of operations. Again, don't look at this crime separately. Next slide, please, and I think that's, okay, now I have to close. So to get to my point, can we go further to, yes. So essentially what I'm trying to get here is that, yes, sure, let's work on strengthening legislation, building capacity, and strengthening international cooperation. But what I want you to discuss today during your deliberations is to have a platform or a regional prosecutorial mechanism on organized crime with sub-thematic working groups on different crimes, including trafficking in persons, will be very productive. This is a platform where you can actually work together on cases, and the umbrella would be an organized crime mechanism, sub-thematic working groups, and use it to work together on real cases, to share intelligence on organized crime, to discuss patterns, emerging trends, share best practices, and so on. And I urge all of you to deliberate on that as one of the tangible outcomes of this conference later. Because we've heard several times of, oh, we need a regional mechanism in Eastern Africa to tackle trafficking in persons. But there's no need to establish something from scratch while we have this platform that we can actually build off of the amazing work that you do. So I want you to think of that and deliberate on that as well while you're having your coffee and samosas. And with that, I am done. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Noram Tomoun. What a great pep talk was this. Asking for your attention for the Unodc Trafficking in Persons report and the conclusions, even more asking for our joint effort in fighting this crime that is a human tragedy and a crime that is degrading, in fact, human dignity. So it's worth our joint effort and international cooperation to take this fight forward. Thank you so much, speakers, panelists, and the presenter. Can I have a big round of applause for all of them? And I'm so sorry that we took so much time of your lunch break, and I will take no responsibility in shorten it. So I'm asking the local organizing committee, what time do we resume here? What time? The program says 2, but that's too short for a lunch break. So what time do we resume? 1 hour. We take exactly 1 hour. It's now, what is the time? 1:45. So 2:45, you all have to be back, and then we resume the afternoon program. Thank you very much. Have a nice meal.